Hi, church. I hope you're doing well. How many of you had parents or teachers growing up who would use the phrase, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all? I feel like it should be a part of Facebook's programming. Before you post a comment, a picture of your second grade teacher would pop up saying, remember, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. I love Googling words to see how their usage has changed over time. And it's not surprising that civility, the word civility or the practice of being civil, has basically bottomed out in the 20th century. The word has made a minor comeback in the last few years, but that's probably because in America there is such an absence of civility that we can't help but comment on it. James, the brother of Jesus, offers strong warning about the tongue and the words that we use, but it seems like a lot of us Christians are just as negligent, just as uncivil with our words as any non-believer that we might come across. Oh, James, don't you know I'm not saved by works, but by grace? So I can go on saying whatever I want about whoever I want, and it doesn't really matter. But we're not talking about James. We're talking about Paul's letter to the Philippians. And in our passage that I'd like to look at today, it almost seems as if the Apostle Paul is completely disregarding such wisdom. And that's problematic, isn't it? And particularly as Paul has just been exhorting us to unity and considering others' interests before our own. How can we challenge one another to do so and to speak words of life, not death, when one of the most prolific authors of Bible seemingly fails to do so? Well, that would be problematic, wouldn't it? Let's take a closer look at the passage. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 2, Paul says this, beware of the dogs, beware of the evil workers, beware of those who mutilate the flesh. I'm sure you already gather that Paul is not offering general advice about avoiding feral dogs. Rather, the dogs are his opponents. In other writings, they are referred to as the Judaizers. They were Jewish Christians who insisted that Gentiles must follow the Torah, including the works of the law like circumcision, in order to be a part of God's people. The interesting part is that the term dog was a word that Jews would often use for Gentiles. Dogs were unclean and something you wanted to stay away from. Cat lovers, you know what I'm talking about. Who am I kidding? There is no such thing as a cat lover. To call this Jewish Christian group dogs would be like today calling a group of Tea Partiers woke. He is calling them the very thing that they wanted to separate themselves most from. What he's doing is showing that their insistence in these identifiers as God's people actually demonstrates that they are not God's people. Their pursuit of righteousness through the fulfillment of works of the law did not yield the righteousness they desire, but made them workers of evil. Their practice of circumcision he likened to those who mutilate the flesh for the pleasure of their little g gods. Think of the prophets of Baal in the showdown with Elijah. Far from insulting or abusing them, Paul is pointing out the ironic and tragic error of their theology. So what difference does this make? I personally think it helps us to know that this wasn't just inflammatory language. Paul is not speaking out both sides of his mouth. This is not in any way inconsistent with anything he's already said. It's also worth pointing out that when Paul initiates something that might be divisive, there's a high bar for him to do so. Paul is addressing an issue not outside the church, but within the church. And the center of this issue is whether the gospel is sufficient for salvation. Furthermore, he had the backing of the first church council behind him. He's also demonstrated when it comes to this issue, he doesn't just write about it, doesn't just post about it, as he did with Peter and Barnabas in Galatia. When he has the opportunity to do so, he addresses it face to face. Anyway, I know you're going to be tempted over the coming weeks to weigh in on some things, maybe even post about them. I hope you'll keep Paul's example in mind as you do so. Grace and peace, church.